Hey, thank you, Cindy, for that introduction. So kind of a little bit on why I was interested in researching this topic. I started thinking about my own experiences living in Compton and sometimes thinking about like drive-bys that happened through my street or how riots would spill out during lunchtime. And so as an education minor, I kind of started thinking about how these things actually affect students. Since violence was so present in my neighborhood, when I came to Santa Cruz, I thought, oh wow, what a safe place to be. But then, to my surprise, when I went to tutor at this high school, which is Costanoa High School, which is the picture that you see right there, I found that there were students here that were experiencing just as much violence as I was, and so that led me to explore this research topic. And so the title of my presentation is "Effects of Violence on the Academic Achievements Attending Continuation High School." And just to start off, I want to define some terms that I will be using throughout my presentation. So when looking at violence, I used the Communities United Against Violence publication that categorized violence into three things. And one of the first things that I categorized it as was intimate violence. And this is intimate violence that exists in intimate and personal relationships. This type of violence usually happens in the home. It happens in the form of sexual abuse, verbal abuse, and physical abuse. And then there's also community violence. And this is violence that exists kind of on the street and in the neighborhood. This can include shootings, stabbings, fights on the street, anything like that. And then there's also state violence. And this is violence that's a little bit it's not as, like, you can't see it as much, like, physically, but it exists through the actions of governmental institutions. And this can mean, like, the prison system or even the injustices that some schools do. So then I'm also going to be talking about academic achievement. And the way that I look at academic achievement is through grades, academic performance index, and this is the state scores schools based on how well their students perform on standardized testing. So the academic performance index has a scale of 200 to 100. And that's just an average of what the standardized test scores for students attending that particular high school have. And then I also look at graduation rates. I see this as an academic achievement because the goal for many students is to graduate from high school, so it's also an academic achievement. And then I also wanted to give an opportunity for students to kind of reflect on their own academics. And so that's why I'm also looking at academic achievement through the lens of the student, and I'm using self-perceptions of academic achievement also. And so now for some background of California and how violence plays into it. California currently ranks at number 9 for homicide rates among youth aged 10 to 24. And out of the 31 counties in California that had a population of over 20,000, Santa Cruz ranked at number 14 for violence for these homicide rates. And looking closer at this data, it also shows that that although Latinos are 44% of this youth population, they made up 53% of these homicides. And so academic achievement in California, as I said before, it's usually measured through the Academic Performance Index, and California has a statewide goal of 800. And so then I looked at the Santa Cruz high schools, and I looked at the three main high schools here, which are SoCal High School, Harbor High School, and Santa Cruz High. And I got the average, and the average was 756, which is pretty close to the statewide goal. So, it looks like these schools would be doing good, but then I looked at the dropout rates. And in California, the dropout rate for Latinos is 21%. And I looked at the dropout rate here in Santa Cruz, and it was 16.9%, which is a little bit lower. But then I looked at what the dropout rate for Latinos were, and out of those 16.9%, 62% of the students were Latino. And some of this data was limited on the dropout rates because it doesn't take into account some alternative schools, which includes continuation schools. And this is mostly because they have some students, they have a high mobility rate, so some students may get out of continuation school and then come back. So it's kind of hard to track which students are graduating or which students are dropping out. And so thinking about this led me to my research question. And my research question is, does violence impact the academic achievements of Latino high school students? And in what way specifically is violence affecting their academic performance? So to answer this question, I decided to look here at Santa Cruz, California, again, because it's number 14 for youth homicide rates. And then I started looking at this particular high school, which I used to tutor at. And this is a continuation high school. It's Costanoa High School. And the average API score for this score is 449, which is well below the state goal. And then this school has a total of 149 students, and which is pretty small. And then 65% of those students are Hispanic. And the API score for these Hispanic students alone is 422, which is even lower than the average for this school. And so for my data, I decided to do participant and public observations. I also did interviews, and then the interviews were transcribed and coded using the in vivo coding method. And then from then, I was able to use grounded theory to kind of develop an answer for my question. So my participants were two high school teachers. One of them I had an interview with, and the other one was just kind of observations and conversations that I had with them. And then my other participants were 6 students. All were Latino, 2 were male, 4 were female, and they were all from the ages 17 through 19. And they all came from the 3 main high schools, SoCal, Harbor High, and Santa Cruz High School. And so I started asking these students about violence. And I started asking them to tell me stories about their everyday lives and what they were experiencing. And in this, I found that I could actually categorize the types of violence they were telling me about. So for like intimate violence, I found that most students kind of just talked about arguments that they had at the home. I know 2 participants stated that they didn't get along with the mom's boyfriend, which kind of led to more arguments in the home. And then when I got to community violence, it was kind of, I had a little bit more variety. And one of the students mentioned, he said that he gets hit up when he's on the street. And I see this as a form of violence because here's other people kind of assuming that he's a gang member. So as he's walking down the street, he can't walk really like peacefully because there's people asking him, oh, where are you from? And things like that. And then, you know, other students mentioned how they participated in a lot of fights. And then 2 of the participants also mentioned how they've experienced shootings. And I'd like to read one quote that I have here. The student states, like that shooting at the apartments. We couldn't leave our cars. We couldn't use our cars. They put that yellow tape around the apartments or whatever. None of us could leave. So that just shows that even with this violence, like it's kind of hard to get out of it. And for this particular student, she wasn't even able to attend class that day into her last period. And then most of the students said how most of this violence that happens in their communities is gang related. So then after that, I started looking for what kinds of state violence or institutionalized violence, which can it also be called that, students are experiencing. And one of the ones that really struck out to me was this first quote. And the student says, the first thing when they stopped me was like, oh, you bang? And this was an actual police officer asking this to one of the students. And I found this interesting because another student had just talked about getting hit up. So in a way, these police officers are also like hitting up their students and or the youth that live here in Santa Cruz. And then you also have I also saw how vulnerable these students were towards falling in the incarceration system. There was another student who said he didn't want to snitch on somebody because he didn't snitch, they took him to juvenile hall. And then he was there for actually 4 weeks. And then another student mentioned who, after this was a female student who was socked in the face by a male student. And so then a police officer came, and she pretty much stated, the cop wanted to arrest me because he said that I provoked him. So even when she didn't commit a crime, something as like provoking another student was making this police officer think that he could arrest the student. So then after kind of talking about violence with the students, I also spoke to them about academic achievement. And I started noticing when they described to me academic achievement, because all these students did come from a different high school, they told me the difference that they had between the previous high school and their current high school, which was Costanoa High School. So for the previous high school, they usually said things like, oh, I don't have enough credits, I wasn't doing that good, and things like that. But then when they talked about Costanoa High School, you saw how their language shifted to more positive terms. They started saying things like they're all right, better than at the old school that I went to. And then I only need 9 more credits to graduate. And that statement right there kind of shows how they see graduation as something more attainable, and how at this school, their overall feelings about academic achievement are better than when they were at their old school. And then I kind of asked students how, like, okay, well, what about these stories? How has violence affected your academic achievement? How has these things affected your academic achievement? And for most students, a lot of them said that they did negative things, and these were things such as doing drugs, going really high to class, not doing work, partying, and hanging around with the wrong crowd. But then what I also noticed that when they spoke about academic achievement at Costa Noa, they started talking about this caring environment that was at this school. And so I noticed from the interviews that I had with the teachers and from my observations of these teachers, how teachers really care about students and shaping a good adult that's going to function in society. So it was more than just teaching them stuff. And then I found this other particular time that I noticed a teacher really care about their student. This student was a Spanish-speaking student, and the teacher was Caucasian, and so he asked her in Spanish, like, she didn't have a period her last class, so she usually went home. So he asked her, why don't you stay after school, or why don't you stay for your last period? And so she answered in Spanish, porque si me quedo, me pongo a pensar en ustedes y me pongo triste, which means because if I stay, I start thinking about you guys, and then I get sad. So even first by using the student's language to communicate to that student and making an effort to communicate with that student on a different level, she's showing that she cares. And also because she's actually telling the student that she cares by saying, I'm gonna get sad thinking about you guys. Because she knows everything that's going on with her students at that school. And then other students had really strong feelings about this school. Another student said, I kind of fell in love with Costa Noa High School. And then I just noticed other like little snippets of students telling me how it was that a teacher cared about their student. And so what I found from this and asking them about violence and academic achievement was that although they could tell me stories, many students did not know how to define violence. And many students, and I feel like that because of this, many students did not believe that violence affected their academic achievement. But at the same time, they told me these stories about how violence was occurring in their communities. And then I also, because of being incarcerated and then thinking about other things outside of school, while they were in school, they weren't allowed to focus. So that let me, the consequences of violence affected students' ability to graduate on time and the ability to focus in school. And I say focus in school because one particular student who throughout the interview didn't really mention anything about violence, but was the only participant to answer yes to the question of, do you feel the need to carry a weapon with you at any time? And he actually had a pocket knife at the time in the interview. So although he didn't say things and he didn't really know how to define violence and put it into context, you could tell that there was some kind of violence occurring in the student's life. And so from these results, I came up with, to answer my question of whether or not violence affects students' academic achievement, there are factors that are tied to violence, such as incarceration and having to deal with law enforcement, that do affect the rates at which students are graduating. And that while violence did affect students' academic achievements, I felt a caring environment often provided another opportunity for students to remain engaged in their academics. So this was opposed to at the other school they had violence and they had a school that they felt that they did not care about it. And so for that, they said that their academic achievement was low. And then I looked at how at this school, although there was still violence in their community and in their lives, they talked about a caring environment, and then they also, at the same time, they also started speaking about how their academic achievements were better. And some of my limitations were just the time. My schedule conflicted a lot with the times of these students to conduct interviews, or some students couldn't stay after school. The number of participants could be increased for next time to have a better sample. And the interview questions could be tailored more to asking more specific questions, especially for those students who don't exactly know how to define violence. And so for the future, I'd like to see what are the effects of violence in 9th and 10th grade, because this continuation school serves 10th through 12th graders. And I kind of noticed how most of the violence they talked about and being at the other school happened in the 9th and 10th grade. So I would like to look at what happens before they're even asked to leave school to go to continuation high school. And also creating more spaces where students can reflect on the violence they experience so that they can kind of not normalize and not see this as something that just occurs and kind of be critical about it. And also create more violence prevention programs in school. Some students were asked to leave school because they got into many fights. Another student, the one who went to juvenile hall, missed 4 weeks of high school, which set him back in getting credit. So then he was asked to leave. So to prevent these students from even being incarcerated and things like that, there could be more violence prevention programs in school that could focus on this.